welcome back to those who could already join our sessions yesterday. And a really very, very warm welcome to everybody who couldn't join yesterday, our final conference of the KnowWar project titled Solidarities in Conflict and War Zones. It's really an absolute pleasure to have so many colleagues here and listen to their arguments, to their perspectives, to their initial research results. So I think we have a wonderful program today as well. The second day of our conference, we will start with a panel on exploring solidarities in the Syrian conflict, a roundtable discussion between Zafar Nahas and Basilius Sino, chaired by Ramia Ismail. Ramia is, by the way, an economist and researcher at the Syrian Center for Policy Research, the SCPR, one of the members of our KnowWar research project. Before I will hand over to Ramia, and I hope she will have a stable connection, and I want to mention just a few technical remarks for all those who couldn't join yesterday, our conference. If you have any kind of technical problems, please contact Al-Sharq immediately. Al-Sharq is our technical service provider, and for sure Al-Sharq will definitely find a solution to all technical problems that may arise over the next 4 hours or so. Secondly, you can find on the bottom of your screen an icon, a planet. There you can select the language in which you want to listen to. As you know, this is a bilingual conference held both in Arabic and in English. So please select the language. This is also an important note for all speakers. Please select the language you will speak, and that means you can be then adequately translated into the other language. Thank you for that. And thirdly, due to the bilingual dimension of our conference, please feel free to post your questions and comments in the chat in English or in Arabic at any time. The comments will be collected and translated and then sent to the moderators of each panel. So this is a background necessity, and therefore please use the chat for your questions and comments. The chat is permanently open, so you can use it during the whole second day of the conference. Send your questions, send your comments. We are absolutely happy to collect them and then to send them to the moderators. They will then raise the questions you have already written in the chat. So really, thank you so much for that. And yes, it's already 5 minutes past 2, Vienna time, 5 minutes past 3 in Beirut, in Palestine, in Syria. That means I will hand over to you, Ramia, for the first panel, an absolutely fascinating one, exploring solidarities in the Syrian conflict. What does that mean? Thank you. Over to you, Ramia.
Thank you so much, Helmut. شكرا جزيلا. تماما. اليوم مرحبا جميعا.
Hello everyone again. So we're meeting once again, and today we will be speaking about something that may be more contestable, and I'm sure that we'll have long discussions about it. As you know, in the long years of the Syrian conflict, we have seen a poverty increase, displacement increase. We have seen more injustice, social injustice, and we have seen that the different parties have used different means of destruction. But the worst maybe was using identities, the different identities the cultural identities, the ethnic identities, sectarian identities, etc., to do that. In our session today, in our panel today, we will hear more about the use of these identities and the conflict. This will start with an introduction, a theoretical introduction. Then you'll hear about the methodology of the research and how the discourse was used. In this panel, we will have with us in the beginning colleague Zafer Nahas, also from the Syrian Center for Policy Research. He has a master's degree, two master's degrees actually, one in general policies from Nottingham and the other from Manchester. And he's very active in dialogue, and he focuses on how a bigger role can be given to immigrants and to refugees and decision-making and policy-making. We also have Basilio Zeno, and he's from Karl Einstein Center. He's a permanent lecturer in political science in Amherst College in Canada. He has a PhD in political science from Massachusetts University, and he focuses on advocacy and on studies related to political violence, colonialism, etc. He was published in different academic magazines and publications, and also his writings were awarded an award in 2019. In the beginning, I would like to start with you, Zafer, to speak about the politicization of identity. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rania. Thank you, everyone. Can you all hear me? And is translation working? Can you see the slides? Is everything okay? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you once again, Ramya. My greetings to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the colleagues, wherever you are. What I'll be talking about is actually part of the work that we were doing at the center. It can be considered as an accumulation or a natural result of the work that we were doing. Through the efforts that were made in the 10 or 11 past years, we focused on understanding the components of the conflict in Syria. We tried to study them, analyze them, and to look into them through three different classifications. First of all, of course, we have the political and economic component, and these were addressed through different papers at the center, like, for example, the war economy through talking about authoritarianism and tyranny, and it has also talked about how this produced a greater collapse in Syria. I will not go into this because there are many publications that were already explained in depth by the center. What I would like to focus on is the social component of the conflict. It's rare that we see people address the social component as a component of the conflict. People often say that it is the impact of the conflict. They don't consider it as a component of the conflict. And this is important for me because we tried to analyze this, and before we worked on determinants concerning the human capital, how it was impacted. We tried to understand the different solidarity networks, the relationships between people, interdependence, the social well-being, and how this impacted the conflict at the level of social fragmentation. And in 2017, we had a publication about this in the center. We also focused on solidarity and how it can be an output of this conflict. We also worked on the politicization of identity. These things use the resources of the society and the machinery of the conflict. Of course, before at the center, we spoke about militarization, how people were incited to be more fanatic, how to hate each other, how there was manipulation of the different belongings. And we'll be also presenting more about this manipulation of identities and belongings, how they want inhabitants of the different population to see each other as rivals, as enemies, and how they diabolize them. In this context, we face two problems. The first one is politicizing the identities themselves. So bringing them from their natural social and cultural interaction to that of the conflict intentionally. And the second problem is related to how these phenomena are being read or understood. And this is what we're discussing today, the knowledge production. And this is related to the issue of identity in Syria in general, and more specifically during the conflict. And I can even say the sectarian and ethnical identities even more specifically. There is a number of readings that are not exhaustive, and they look into the conflict in Syria, saying that it is a sectarian-based conflict, or that it is a result because of this difference, but we will look more into this. To address these problems, what we're seeking to do is to develop a concept for the politicization of identity during the conflict in Syria. What does this mean? How can we analyze these practices? This is what I'll be presenting. This is what we'll try to discuss today. Also, how can we read the different phenomena that express these identity politics, whether during the conflict or even before it? We will see how it was used, and through this understanding, we'll see how it's possible to develop maybe some exit routes. So there is a number of phenomena that we will try to dissect, and then we'll try to understand who the actors are, who are those impacted the most. There will be a vision, and we'll try also to look into the different schools, but there is, in a nutshell, a vision showing that the society is only affected, impacted by the policies and the politics of the elite and those who have the influence. And there are others that look more into sectarianism, but we will look into both later on. To be able to overcome these readings and look into the different components and how they interact with each other at a different level, we will try to develop a framework that will allow us later on to answer, because now we don't have an answer, because we want to understand how these identities were used or exploited. What were the tools? How was fanaticism created? What were the identities that were targeted? Who targeted them? Why? How did they use that to their benefit? Of course, we didn't benefit from that. How did the different regional balances also affect that? So we will try to find together how we can reach an answer to that. How did the society interact with the policies of identity? Did they really go after them? Did they fall in their trap? Were they able to overcome them? We will try to understand all of that. Now, with regards to politicization, I need to clarify something. Politicization means that we have an issue that wasn't really related to politics, but it was dragged into politics, all into the political action. It was inserted on the political agenda. So when we speak about the destructive impact of this politicization, this doesn't mean that we adopt an approach saying that the politicization of issues really express the fact that they're being exploited, because in the public sphere, if there are things that are sometimes put on the political agenda, then maybe they can gain some momentum and this can be beneficial. Now, it's not the case when it comes to identity politicization during the conflict in Syria. But I just wanted to clarify this once and for all with regards to politicization. Now, for identity politicization, this might seem as if we were targeting only the identity, but the identity is not like a situation that we can grab. This is why one component is being targeted here, and this is maybe the definitions like the family, the ethnicity, the religion. It can also be about encouraging a certain football team, a specific race, a specific ethnicity, any determinant within this identity. How is this being targeted? It's being done through threats, through provocation, through amplification, through reductionism, through using some symbols, through using the narrative of victims. It means manipulating these belongings and identities, whether at the individual or the collective level. So the result is that we have one determinant that seizes the whole space of identity and becomes like a dictator. And this determinant pushes people to say, I'm just a woman, I'm just a Druze, I'm just a Sunnite. So this reduced determinant is then facing another reduced determinant. Now, for the procedural definition that we are following now for the purposes of this research, I think it is a number of policies like political, social policies, support areas, transportation means. All of these can be under this title. And they want to use the belongings of the different persons in order to use their capacities and their potential in the machinery of the conflict. They want the identities to become weapons in this conflict. This is why they use reductionism in a specific number of determinants, and the determinants that were important before are not the same determinants that are important today. And they use this determinant of victim to show how they're contradictory with the other in order to build this animosity. This politicization of identity targets the essence of the individual and the group, but it also misnames the spheres of social interaction. So we have the identity and the surrounding context. And these contexts are related to culture, to traditions, to how people perceive themselves, to the image of the enemy. So it's extended to show how what's happening today impacts also posting some discourses, and they also invest in the past, and then they show everything that is said in the past. Everyone is an enemy. Look at what they did to us in I don't know when. And this is a great problem, because then there is not only a problem facing us in really checking if this information is real, but in a nutshell, they're using the belongings in order to drag people into these conflicts. To go back to how this phenomenon was read by the different schools, there is, of course, a panoply of approaches, psychological approaches, political approaches, but we chose 3 classifications that we think are quite inclusive. And the first, we see the authentic fanaticism in identity. Belonging means that we need to be fanatic, and this means that conflict is inevitable because of this difference. This school assumes that identity is sustainable, and other determinants like religion, like gender, have sometimes also biological aspects, like we have specific groups with specific biological aspects. And here, of course, this is something dangerous, because this leads to killing others, to eliminating others, especially during conflict. This reading also resembles the new Orientalism, like some researchers say. When we look into the conflicts in our region, they look at the region, like Barack Obama said, it's been 1,000 years that they've been fighting with each other, and now we think that we can solve this. They're always like this. We can't do anything about them. This is what Obama said. And we can see this sometimes in the songs and the different hymns, etc. And what's really special here is that it's not limited to determinants that were there before the conflict, like the clan, like the race, etc. But it goes back also to displacement, to immigration, to political loyalty, and these new determinants also can be reduced, and they're ready to use to go to the battleground against the other that is different, the other that is the enemy. So this is the first school about the authentic fanaticism. The second school says, no, it's not like this. There is a number of elites that are manipulating everything. It's as if the identities were like a dough, and they can be made in different shapes by the elites, and these don't have any values when they're not linked to a specific ideological career. For example, sectarianism becomes an ideology, and there is no importance to sectarianism without the political aspect, and it becomes the sectarianism, or the elites are the only ones telling us, go, go, come, come, do this, do that. Now, of course, these two schools are totally different, and they can greatly impact the way we see conflict in Syria. The third approach assumes that things are different. It's social constructivism. It thinks that here identity is not fixed, but also it's not totally open. It is based on social interactions between individuals and groups, and they change. They change when and when there are differences at the social level or when the circumstances change. And sometimes the identities of the group can be too strong and they can impede the capacity of the political elite, and then the elite cannot manipulate the social identities. Now, after looking into these three schools real quick, Zafar, you still have 2 minutes. I still have 2 minutes anyway. There is a clear way to monitor how identities were manipulated during the conflict and how they were exploited, and it's securitization. And this is what I talked about in Copenhagen school. And here, for example, I can have a certain issue that is not very important. It's not political. It's not related to the conflict. But what I do is that I create a certain danger for one of the groups, and I make this group feel that they're threatened and they need protection. And here we need to focus on demanding urgent action. For example, we say, immigrants will occupy our country. And this is not social, this is something related to home security, to homeland security. So here many procedures can be taken because this is something related to security. Now, if we look into what's happening in Syria, many readings took this securitization into consideration, but the problem in Syria and also other countries is that the securitization has been there for decades. So we have urgent actions that continued for decades, so that it became really normalized afterwards. So this framework is not enough anymore. Finally, how can we analyze this? Based on our preliminary data from Syria, we can monitor the different discourses, the different statements, the social media, and we can look into how the enemy is being perceived, is being created, and all of this leads to further fragmenting society so that they cannot reconstruct themselves anymore. Finally, allow me to say, and here this is not the result, this is not a consequence. I don't want you to understand that this is a conclusion because we still haven't discovered what's happening. We need to say that today there is an identity dimension for the conflict in Syria today. And I say today, why? Because this is not an authentic feature of the Syrian society. But the way to read and understand this dimension today is sensitive. And this is what we will use to propose how there could be an exit from that. And after me, my colleague Basilios will tackle our methodology of work, our methodology of reading this phenomenon. This is everything that I had to say. Thank you, Basilios. Thank you, Ramya. The floor is yours. Thank you, Dafir.
Thank you very much, Dafir. We shall continue with our colleague Basilios about methodology and the battle over identity. You have the floor, Basilios. Is your microphone muted? We can hear you now. Thank you. Can you see the slides? Yes. Hello to you all. Allow me to time myself first. Thank you very much, Zafar, for this very interesting presentation. Today, I will be talking about the approach of the center and our vision. And then I will talk about a case study about work that I have done about how to create that discourse and how to create the imagined border between confessions in the Syrian conflict, and how the turning point, or where the turning point was in the discourse and the mobilization on the level of identities. First of all, regarding the approach of the center, it particularly aims at the conditions and circumstances that were particularly against that in order to use identity as a way to mobilize resources. And here we would like to say that this happened in particular contexts because the Syrian conflict was not the same all over the country. It had many variations from area to another, from region to another. This politicization of some identities aimed at serving the interests of some local powers. And it is important for us to see how the reaction was. And we use in this approach a participative approach that is interdisciplinary as well. And we use the quantitative and the qualitative means on various levels. The first level is about the areas, not only on the level of governorates, but also at the level of neighborhoods. This is from people who knew the reality on the ground. If you allow me, Basilius, if I can ask you to go a little bit slower for the purpose of interpretation so that they can keep up with you. I'm running between interpretation and time, he says. So we use in this approach, as I have said, a participative approach that is multidisciplinary. The first level includes a field research team, and this team will develop questionnaires that are a questionnaire that is deep, as they know the area very well. As for the second level of analysis, it includes a smaller team of researchers and experts who will be analyzing the data after it is collected. And of course, there are other details that I will be happy to talk about if you should ask. As for the third and last level that adds a new approach or dimension to our work, includes the local community, as we will discuss the results and discuss them with them after our field work. After we are done with the analysis, we will share the results and the analysis with the various sectors and factions of the local communities, be it in Syria or Syrians abroad. And here we have to take that into consideration, given the situation of displacement in Syria, as half of the population have been forced to move, and these are internally or externally displaced, and this was over 10 years. As we know that we have many families that have children and nationalities and other passports and nationalities. So it is very important when we talk about identity, not to limit things to the Syrian ground only, but to also include those who have been displaced and who need to recreate the relations with the various areas. Our approach includes a way of reading things with three dimensions. The first dimension is about mechanisms, policies, and actions that have been adopted by the various conflicting forces. The objective is to understand how and when the use of identity started. As for the second dimension, it is about the interaction of those identities, particularly within adapting or accepting this discourse, interacting with this discourse, or resisting it through local solidarity. How did the local communities interact with the policies, and to what extent did they resist it, and how did the identities actually change in some areas? In areas like Raqqa that saw a great social dismantlement in order to track the impact after ISIS collapsed. It is very important to be aware that there are many families that had to leave the regions out of fear for their lives. As for the last dimension, it is about the impact of the destructive identities and the erosion of human capital for the new identities that can be used to renew that conflict. This is very important, as in case the vision that Taffer talked about is materialized with ethnics and confessional groups, it will be a very difficult, and this is something that was going to happen sooner or later. Or there is another approach that says there was a change in identities, and in reality people look at themselves in a more confessional way, for example. So it is a de facto solution. So let us bring those confessions to have to talk and to have a dialogue, or to reach what is called a consensus democracy, or a sharing of power, which is very dangerous, as we saw it in Iraq or in Lebanon, as it will be setting the ground for new explosions in the future, particularly for those who work and who capitalize on those identities. This is when it comes to the approach and the methodology of the center before going into the field work. As for today's discussion, the objective of this is to confirm types of solidarity that showed up during the past 10 years, that also go through challenges given the economic collapse, the sanctions, and the great immigration that hit the country. As a study I have, as a case I have studied, we are talking about the institutionalization of violence and the change of the curriculum in Syria in the last 10 years, as many authoritarian forces have changed the content of school curricula in a way that creates a further division. The identity is not presented as the Syrian identity, as part of the Arab identity anymore, but we are at another level. Your identity is Sunni or Alawi, Kurdish, not Kurdish, and so on. So there are at least 5 or 6 changes like that that were done, that we have tracked, and these are preparing for a generation that has been ideologized. So this is an institutionalization of violence in a way that stops working on a sustainable system for the long run. And here I would like to talk about the search or research that I've done. My research is about boundary making, and it was published in Nations and Nationalism. And the research included the mechanisms for confessionalization that were used. I can share the first images that you see. It was very common, particularly after 2013, to portray the conflict in a caricature way, as if it is a conflict between two ontologies that exist, two differences that exist de facto, as if whether we say Sunni, Alawi, or Shiite, as if we are talking about one bulk, about one group or one state. The Spectator, for instance, talked about Islam's 30 years of war, and this is in relation to the creation of Iran's Islamic State in 1979, and the Catholic and Protestant war in Europe. So it is a projection. To the right, you can see a map, for example, and we've all seen that type of maps that are colored in the past 10 years that show the area of control of the forces in Syria according to their background, as if these are the motives. So we see the areas where there are Sunnis, other where there are Alawites, and points that are pink or colored to show the mixed areas. To the left, we see another map that was used as an ethnocitarian vision by the colonialist powers to see the redrawing of the maps according to the recreation of Syria constitutionally and administratively based on small states within the greater state of Syria. Of course, these attempts have failed. There were at least 3 or 4 administrative attempts to have the Alawi state, the Aleppo state, the Druze state, and so on. What I mean here is to say that we have to be aware of the importance of the context and the importance of the concepts and concept creation. There are, for example, stamps that were used in 2012 and 2013 about the Alawis asking for a definition, about them asking the French to remain in the country in Syria. Of course, these documents are not true, but they were spread as if they were. We can see as well that the minority was presented as if it is something that goes back thousands of years. For example, the 11th version of Britannica, the encyclopedia, between 2010 2011 did not have an entry called minorities, whereas in 1929, the 14th edition, including an entry about minorities that exceeded 16 pages. This is very important. How can a concept that did not even exist politically to come along in 1929? This is very important, as the vision of minorities and majorities has been around for thousands of years. In our region, it did not show up, along with the confessional or sectarian attitude in the mid-20s of the last century. So the main question that was the starting point for the research was what led to the transformation of the discourse in Syria from a revolution for all Syrians to a confessional talk. This discourse does not reflect the reality of what was on the ground. What is the regional role at the time in the recreation and restatement of the literature after the Sunni or the Syrian revolution? How can we look at this intertwining of the approaches that go from the bottom up and also go from the top to bottom? We need to review all of these and see how they are linked. Here in my argument, I say that at a very important phase, what we call critical juncture, such as the Arab uprising, the alliance between local and supralocal actors and the struggle over representation and symbolic power shape and is shaped by intragroup dynamics and the In that case, we have struggles between the opposition factions themselves and the strategies of boundary making. And here I mean the sectarianization, along with the struggle over who gets access to the state of power on the ground. And in my argument, I say that following the militarization of the Syrian uprising, which began in the summer of 2011, the dynamics of the internationalization were intensified and new strategies of categorization and identification practices emerged online and on the ground, online and social media, in a way that was unprecedented. The objective of my research was to see the interaction between the local and supra-local actors, for them to see the literature of and the stories presented by the regime about the jihadists, which has led to an activation, a political activation of a group that is called the Confession. Before I continue, I have to mention the concepts that are very important in clarifying what we mean for every point. I am calling sectarianism, and it is usually identified as the political mobilization of religious differences as a framework for the distribution of rights, privileges, and even violence among certain populations. I am using here the definition of sectarianism and not the sectarian identity. I'm saying sectarian identification, which means that it is a procedure or something that could change. It is not fixed, and accordingly, I build on what was mentioned by the sociology as the challenge of the treatment of sects, and this is to go and look at the relation and representation, and in writing and in interviews, the sects are presented as groups that exist in a de facto situation, and that they have a voice that needs to be conveyed, whereas the concept that we use is more one that calls for de-essentialization or denaturalization of those identities through dealing with things as an event that could succeed or could fail. We also make a difference, and we make a distinction between the common sense and the analytical understanding. Allow me to interrupt you. You have 2 minutes, Vasilios. So I am confirming on the theoretical aspect here. We have to make the distinction between the categories of practice and the categories of analysis. I shall dwell on that later in case you have questions about that. Regarding my research, I will focus on the theoretical only, and I will share all the slides. In the first week, after the first week of the uprising, Buthayna Shaban talked about the attempt of 1979 of a strife in the start of the Muslim Brotherhood in Latakia. Also, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qardawi in Qatar gave a fatwa that was out of context, saying that the President Assad is in charge of or responsible for what happened in Daraa. For the first time, we saw that there was a use of the word sect in the profiles and by the supporters of the regime at the time. And what is said here is, my confession is Syrian. Writing your sect on Facebook or any other media was considered as a very major issue that would cause you quite some trouble. I will conclude after 2 slides, but I would like to talk that say that the discourse changed in February and March. It was different than what it was in April and May, where it was talking about the negatives of the uprising with what we call the boundary blurring. After that, between June and December 2011, we saw that there was militarization and internationalization. And even on the ground, we saw that some categories were getting funds in order to Islamize some groups. After that, we started seeing, particularly after February 2012, a further support for some groups and the marginalization of others at the expense of the creation of a political solution in the country. Basilius is muted. Basilius, you are muted. So we have to look, and I have to focus on the idea that we have to look at different issues intertwined, the idea of social media, of mainstream media, along with the funds that came from some supra-local actors, which is also a complex a concept after what was suggested on social media against Bashar al-Assad. The logos were presented as a representative or a reflection of the ideas on the ground, and they were considered a normal expression of what the population needs. This is a radical example. When manifestations or protests were prepared to support Nusra in Syria, considering that they are a reflection of Syria, and where it was considered that there is no terrorism in Syria besides the terrorism of al-Assad. This is where we went from groups that were exercising the identity to a phase of normalization as a recognition of those groups as a normal faction, a normal group of the population. This is a date as well where there was a mention of minorities, and that talk started seeing a focus on the Iran-Saudi conflict as being represented as a Sunni and Shiite conflict. We also saw the amounts of monies that were transferred as a support, and we saw that it came to support the most fanatic in Syria, and this reflects particularly in 2012, as we saw that there is a huge number of tweets that focus on the word jihad and donations. In conclusion, I would like to confirm the need to deal with a lot of caution with the words that we use, and to make a distinction between the analytical and descriptive categories, and to say that the conflict in Syria, what happened was not a fate, but it was systemic. And as Ramya mentioned yesterday, this division on identity sometimes was exclusionary, and it excluded other identities. Thank you very much for your time and for your kind attention. Thank you, Basilius. There are many questions. This is why I was trying to be strict with time so you can respond to questions. Since we have a lot of questions, let's try to be short and give directly the answer. The first question is, why is there an absence of the issue of Palestine and their continued Nakba and the relation between the internal and external? I repeat the question, says the speaker. Basilius, your microphone is muted again. So why is there an absence of the issues linked to the Palestinians and their continuous Nakba and the identity on the internal and external level? I agree 100%. The question is very important, and this was shown in the solidarity path, for example, that came to public in 2013, as we saw what the Syrian regime forces did. Here we are not sharing or splitting the victims, but there is like a double invisibility. Since the Syrian Nakba is great and the focus was on I am the main victim, you are the secondary victim, and we see that there is a hierarchy trying to be established of who was the main victim, but I can confirm 100%. And this is why we said at the beginning that the approach is empirical, and there is also a theoretical approach. And we mentioned that we are focused on an aspect because the focus on Damascus makes it that there is a risk. We find a lot of that, but that makes it that there are many groups that are dismissed that include Syrians or others, and I have met a lot of people in Canada and in other areas, and there is a lot of call for solidarity. The politicization of the identity, as we said, is something that is not limited, and here we also have to look at the identity as something that is not fixed. It is an identity as a man, a woman, Palestinian, Arab, LGBT. We have to take all those components, and this approach, of course, will lead to the final result. Thank you for the question. Besides the ethnic identity, we have differences and division between rural and the cities and the urban. We have classes, we have factions, we have a lot of divisions. A question for you, Dafer. You have read the question. To what extent is violence important in the analysis of the politicization of the identity?
I was thinking about violence as a cause and as a result. Violence as a cause to mobilize the identities and to pave the way before facilitating this mobilization, this polarization. And I was thinking also about structural violence that exists within the policies and the laws to which societies were subjected for years, because these also can change the whole potential of change into fanaticism, for example. So I think it is significant. We have like the accelerator in chemistry, if you remember. So this accelerates the deprivation of these societies, of their potential, of their capacities, of their agency. Maybe I'm here being proactive a little bit, but these historical violence situations or the current ones are evidence that build these beliefs based on this mobilization. Yes, in literature, violence is considered as a tool that's used. We have the burnt land, for example, policies that is used in Idlib, and this is instigating hatred from one identity towards the other. Yes, it is fueling the conflict. there is also a recognition of attribution. So if there is knowledge that there is attribution to these different entities, so knowing that this assumption exists helps me to fuel it, even if it's not real. I will take one more question. I know that we're past the time that was allocated to this panel. So a quick question. Why do these politicians try all of that, although these people come from their own societies, from their own communities? This is, of course, a very important question, but please, in brief. Yes, of course. After 1990, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and after the Cold War, we have seen this explosion of questions also in Yugoslavia between the Croatians, the Bosnians, etc. And also I've seen that in Rwanda. There were different resisting entities, and I'll speak also about Iraq and Syria. Many entities wanted Yugoslavia to remain united, and there are those who wanted to make everything nationalistic. And we have seen in Syria that the categories that believe in a united identity far from reductionism are being either assassinated or marginalized, because there is an overlap between war, profit, the capital coming from weapons and arms. There are many interventions. There is also a conflict on the symbolic representation, on the symbolic capital. Who represents, for example, the armed forces in Syria? We have seen assassinations between conflicting parties. Although there were people that had the same narrative, we have seen later on that they were fighting against each other. So we have these forces, we have the civilians, and there were always identities working, or united identities working against this fragmentation, and we still find them now. And they want to rebuild the Syrian society. But because of the sectarianization, this is why we have this explosion of identities. Thank you very much. Thank you, Zafar. Thank you, Basilios. I apologize for this delay. And please, let's move to the next session. Thank you.
Thank you really so much, Ramya, and thanks a lot to Basilios and Zafar. I think we had a wonderful discussion that could have lasted, let's say, for the next 10 hours as well, due to the complexity of the phenomena and the complexity of your analysis. So it's absolutely great. Thank you really so much. I think due to the format of our conference is an online conference. We thought it is absolutely necessary to have a short break after each session because it's really exhausting. We are concentrating our own energies to follow everything. So it's fine, I think, to have a break now of 10 minutes. And then we will start with our next panel, Confronting War and Colonialism, Solidarity Economy in Syria and Palestine. And for sure, I'm looking forward to our next speakers, to our next colleagues. In 10 minutes, we are back. Thank you.